Picture a boxer, like in the locker room, just violently pacing around, right? Punching lockers, actively hyping himself into this blind rage before a fight. And then picture someone in a dimly lit yoga studio.
Taking those deep, measured breaths.
Exactly. Trying to find that absolute Zen state. Well, what if I told you that neurologically and psychologically speaking, those two people are doing the exact same work?
Oh.
So welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive. We are taking this massive, fascinating stack of sources you provided on emotional regulation, and our mission today is to kind of rescue this concept.
Yeah, rescue it from all those pop psychology buzzwords, right?
Right? Because true emotional regulation, it isn't just about taking deep breaths or, retreating to a mental spa. We're looking at rigorous science here, from Stanford labs to MRI scanners to these huge cross-cultural behavioral studies, all to understand how we actually manage the mechanics of our feelings. So, okay, let's unpack this. We really need to establish a new baseline for what we actually mean when we talk about emotional regulation. Where do we even start?
Well, to find that baseline, we kind of have to look at the winding intellectual road that got us here. The ancestry of this concept, it arguably starts with Sigmund Freud back in the early 20th century.
Oh, right. Freud.
Yeah, he gave us the idea of unconscious defense mechanisms, repression, denial, projection. He basically operated on this hydraulic model of the mind.
Like steam in a pipe.
Exactly like steam in a pipe. If you didn't vent those emotions, the pressure would just build up and cause a neurosis. That was really the first systematic attempt to explain how people manage unwanted feelings, but he viewed it entirely as this unconscious conflict resolution happening in the dark.
Right, so the individual isn't actively deciding to regulate. Their psyche is just throwing up shields to survive.
Right. But then, moving into the mid-century, psychologist Richard Lazarus really shifts the lens. He starts framing emotional management as conscious coping.
Okay, so bringing it out into the open.
Yeah. By the 1960s, and then later in his big 1984 work, he argued that how you cognitively appraise a stressor is what completely determines the biological emotion that follows.
Meaning, like, a barking dog is only scary if you actually appraise it as a threat.
You got it. And around that same time, John Bowlby's attachment theory introduces this fascinating concept of co-regulation. Because infants, they literally lack the neurological hardware to regulate their own emotions.
Oh, well, so what do?
They have to borrow a caregiver's nervous system. When a parent holds a crying baby and breathes slowly, the baby's vagus nerve physically syncs with the parent's, physically lowering the infant's heart rate.
Wait, really?
Yeah. The caregiver is providing a temporary neurological scaffold, basically, that the child eventually internalizes.
Borrowing a nervous system, that is just such a striking image. It really grounds the concept in biology rather than just, abstract psychology. But the actual term emotion regulation, like as its own dedicated modern scientific field that doesn't actually show up until much later in the sources you provided.
Right. The modern field was essentially crystallized in 1998. That's when James Gross at Stanford published this landmark integrative review. He pulled all these scattered ideas, Freud's defenses, Lazarus's coping, Bowlby's attachment, all into one cohesive framework.
So he's putting all the pieces together.
Yeah, and Gross was directly pushing back against this massive cultural legacy from the 60s and 70s pop psychology era, an era totally dominated by catharsis theory.
Catharsis theory, that's the idea that expressing your feelings, no matter what they are, is unambiguously healthy, right? Like scream into a pillow, let the steam out of the pipe.
Exactly. But Gross recognized that the biological data just didn't support that. Screaming into a pillow often just makes you angrier, to be honest. But he also pushed back on the physiological literature that proved rigidly expressing your emotions had severe bodily costs. So he carved out a very nuanced middle ground.
Okay, so how did he define it?
He defined emotional regulation as the processes by which people influence which emotions they have, when they have them, and how they experience and express them.
Now, notice what is missing from that definition. It doesn't say controlling. It doesn't say calming down. And that brings us right back to the boxer.
Oh, absolutely. Intensifying an emotion is just as much regulation as damping one.
Right. A boxer hyping himself into a rage, or even someone delivering a eulogy who has gone completely numb, and they're actively trying to summon sadness to honor their loved one. They are both regulating. So folk psychology treats regulation like a fire extinguisher just putting out the flames. But Gross is saying it's actually a thermostat. Sometimes you need to intentionally turn the heat up.
That thermostat analogy gets right to the heart of why Gross's definition was so contested early on by clinical psychology.
Because they just wanted to put out the fires.
Pretty much. For decades, clinicians essentially treated regulation as synonymous with not crying, not yelling, just holding it together. Gross's core insight is that regulation is a multi-layered process. It occurs at multiple points in time, and the process itself is completely morally neutral.
Okay, meaning it's not inherently good or bad.
Right. It is only more or less adaptive for whatever your specific goal is in that specific context.
Well, if this is a timeline, like a multi-step process, I really want to map the escalation. Because if we can see exactly how a feeling forms, we can figure out how to intercept it before it takes over the steering wheel. Let's look at the earliest possible intervention in Gross's model.
Okay, so the earliest interception happens before the emotion even exists. Gross calls this situation selection. You simply choose to approach or avoid a scenario that you know will trigger a specific state.
So, like, a college student knows she gets intense, debilitating anxiety during confrontational debates.
So she intentionally picks a low-conflict group project for her elective. She's regulating her emotion by curating her environment.
But, I mean, you can't always avoid the environment, right? Sometimes you're already in the situation and the stakes start rising.
Right, so then you move to situation modification. You're in the scenario, but you alter the physical parameters to change its emotional trajectory. The classic example in your sources is a parent who realizes their toddler is about to have a massive meltdown in a crowded grocery store checkout line.
Ah, so they just abandoned the cart and moved the toddler to the quiet car.
Exactly. The trigger is still there, the toddler didn't get the candy, but changing the physical environment modifies the emotional intensity.
But what if you're trapped? Say, a child in a doctor's waiting room staring at a tray of needles. They can't avoid the room and they can't change the room. The feeling of terror is actively bubbling up.
In that case, you redirect attention within the unchangeable situation. Gross terms this attentional deployment. Instead of letting the child stare at the needle and build a panic response, the parent pulls out a brightly colored picture book.
Oh, so you starve the emotion of the cognitive focus it needs to grow.
Exactly. Which brings us to Walter Mischel's famous marshmallow test.
Oh, yeah. Culturally, we usually frame the marshmallow test as this ultimate trial of raw willpower, right? Preschoolers left in a room with one marshmallow. If they don't eat it, they get two. We tend to think the kids who held out were just these tiny stoics, white-knuckling their way through temptation.
Right, but looking at the actual observational data, the kids who succeeded were aggressively using attentional deployment. What's fascinating about those 4-year-olds is how physically inventive they were with their attention.
You weren't just sitting there staring at it.
No, they weren't using brute force self-control at all. They spontaneously covered their eyes, they sang loudly to themselves, they physically turned the plate around so the candy was out of their direct line of sight.
They even used cognitive framing, didn't they? Like imagining the marshmallow was a fluffy little cloud instead of a sugary treat.
Yeah, they were strategically hacking their own attentional bandwidth.
Though I think it is worth throwing in a quick methodological caveat from the sources on this specific study. A 2018 replication of the marshmallow test by Tyler Watts and colleagues. They used a much larger, more socioeconomically diverse sample.
Yes, and their findings were super important. They found that once you statistically control for early cognitive ability and family background, the predictive power of how long a kid waited on their later life outcomes shrank substantially.
Right, because a wealthy kid might wait because they trust adults to deliver the second marshmallow, whereas a kid from a scarce environment eats it immediately because experience has taught them promises get broken. It's a great reminder not to overread the causal claims of any single classic study. But the underlying mechanism using attention to regulate that remains completely valid.
Oh, the mechanism is undeniably robust, but eventually mere distraction fails. The needle is going into the arm or the rejection letter is in your hand. The next interception point is cognitive change, widely known as reappraisal.
Okay, so reinterpreting the fundamental meaning of a situation.
Exactly. You get fired from a job. Initially, your brain interprets this as, I am worthless, triggering deep shame. Reappraisal is actively shifting that narrative to, that role was stifling my growth, and this forces me to pivot. You change the cognitive meaning, which chemically alters the downstream emotion.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Does simply talking about a feeling count as cognitive change, or is that a totally different biological mechanism? Like when a therapist tells you to just talk through what you're experiencing.
Matthew Lieberman explored this exact question in a 2007 fMRI study called Putting Feelings into Words. Participants lay in a brain scanner looking at highly emotionally charged faces, and they were asked to do one simple thing: label the emotion. Just say the word angry or sad.
So they weren't trying to reframe anything.
No, they were explicitly not asked to reframe it, reappraise it, or change their perspective at all.
So they are just verbalizing the obvious. What actually changes in the brain's architecture when you do that?
Merely finding the word forces blood flow into the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain responsible for language and executive function. And because the brain has a limited metabolic budget, engaging this higher order language center physically inhibits the amygdala, which is the raw, rapid-fire threat detection hub.
Wow. So the linguistic processing essentially acts as a neurological brake pedal on your panic system.
It really does. It gives neural weight to the therapist's maxim, name it to tame it. Just articulating an emotion starves the biological alarm system of resources without any deliberate, effortful reappraisal.
Okay, so we have avoidance, modification, distraction, and reappraisal. All these intervene before the emotion reaches its peak. But what happens if all of those fail? The emotion has fully hijacked your system, your heart is hammering, your face is hot, you are furious or terrified.
Then you have reached the final line of defense, which Gross calls response modulation. The emotion is fully underway, and you are trying to directly alter your physiological or behavioral reaction after the fact.
So this is forcing a deep breath to slow your heart, or pouring a stiff drink to numb the nervous system.
Or most commonly, masking your face to suppress the expression.
So suppression is the absolute last resort when the system is overwhelmed. Let's look at the actual physical toll on our bodies when we rely heavily on that last-ditch effort.
The biological cost of suppression is massive. In 1997, James Gross and Robert Levinson ran a clinical study where participants watched highly disgusting films footage of surgical amputations and severe burns.
Oh, man, rough watch.
Very. Half the group was told to watch normally. The other half was instructed to suppress all outward expressions of emotion. They had to keep their faces totally blank, betraying nothing.
The internal friction of that must be agonizing.
The monitoring equipment showed just how agonizing it was. The suppressors didn't feel any less disgusted internally. The subjective experience of the horror was identical. But their sympathetic nervous systems, which control the fight-or-flight stress response, spiked significantly higher than the control group.
So their blood pressure climbed, their sweat glands activated.
Exactly. Hiding the emotion physically damaged their baseline state more than just experiencing it.
But the sources note a wild secondary effect here, too. The physiological stress didn't just spike in the person suppressing, it spiked in the people sitting in the room with them. Why would a bystander's nervous system freak out just because I'm keeping a straight face?
Because we are a deeply social species, heavily reliant on microexpressions to gauge safety in our environment. When a bystander watches someone expending immense, rigid effort to remain completely blank while watching a horrifying amputation, it creates profound cognitive dissonance.
Because the social cues aren't matching up to the situation.
Right. The bystander's nervous system registers that a massive threat is present, but the social cues are saying everything is fine. That friction triggers a stress response in the observer. Furthermore, Jane, Richards, and Gross followed this up in 1999 and 2000 and found that suppression heavily impairs memory.
Wait, memory. Let me make sure the underlying logic tracks here. Is this essentially a computer RAM issue? Like, if half my cognitive processing power is dedicated to running a background program called Do Not Let Anyone See How Grossed Out You Are, my brain literally lacks the available bandwidth to encode new memories of the conversation happening around me.
That is the exact mechanism. Your attentional bandwidth is completely hijacked by the effort of masking, leaving nothing left for memory consolidation.
I have to push back on the absolute nature of this finding, though. Is suppression universally toxic? Because anyone who's ever worked a customer service job or been an ER nurse or a teacher knows that you have to keep a straight face sometimes.
Yeah.
You can't just let every raw emotion fly in a professional or high-stakes setting.
That's a very fair point. If we connect this to the bigger picture, your pushback is completely validated by the cross-cultural data. A massive 2010 meta-analysis by Aldao and colleagues did confirm that, broadly in Western contexts, reappraisal is linked to better psychological health and suppression to worse.
But there's a caveat.
Yes, a profound cultural caveat. A 2007 study by Butler, Lee, and Gross compared European American and Asian American participants. Habitual suppression predicted worse cardiovascular and psychological outcomes for the European Americans. But for the Asian American participants, suppression carried almost none of those physiological costs.
Because context dictates the meaning of the action.
Exactly. In cultural contexts where emotional restraint, interpersonal harmony, and prioritizing the group over the individual are highly valued normative behaviors, suppression isn't processed by the brain as an inauthentic, stressful masking of the true self.
It's processed as a polite, pro-social, deeply appropriate action.
Right. It perfectly proves Gross's original point. No single regulatory strategy is inherently toxic or universally healthy. It depends entirely on the goal, the environment, and the cultural wiring.
Which naturally transitions us into what happens when society applies the wrong strategy to systemic problems. Because the sources highlight a severe cautionary tale about the corporate misuse of emotional regulation.
Oh, we see this extensively in modern corporate wellness programs. An employer will have a highly toxic workplace, unsafe conditions, unreasonable hours, or the looming threat of mass layoffs.
And instead of fixing those foundational issues, they offer employees mandatory resilience training or like mindfulness apps.
Or seminars on how to regulate their stress.
Yes.
Occupational health psychologists heavily criticize this practice.
So telling an employee to regulate their stress about an actively hostile workplace is basically handing out umbrellas inside a leaking building instead of just fixing the roof.
I love that analogy. When workplaces push internal coping, telling you to cognitively reappraise or suppress your completely justified anxiety, when what is actually required is situation modification, fixing the structural problem, they're weaponizing the science.
Right. Taking a systemic environmental failure and individualizing the blame onto the employee's inability to regulate. And while we're talking about massive shifts in how we apply these concepts, we have to touch on the cutting-edge theoretical fight happening in the field right now. Because for decades, we've relied on Paul Ekman's model, right? The idea that emotions like anger, fear, and joy are hardwired universal presets bubbling up from deep in the ancient brain.
Right, the basic emotion theory.
But looking at your sources, Lisa Feldman Barrett's constructed emotion theory totally blows that up. She's arguing these aren't prepackaged presets at all.
No, they aren't. Barrett's 2017 book, How Emotions Are Made, challenges the bedrock of everything we've discussed. She posits that there are no hardwired emotion circuits in the brain. Instead, your brain acts as a prediction engine, constantly monitoring your body's metabolic budget.
Monitoring internal physical signals.
Yes, this monitoring is called interoception. It's your brain's perception of raw internal physical signals, like an elevated heart rate, a tight chest, or low blood sugar.
Just raw physiological data without a label.
Exactly. The brain takes those raw physical signals, rapidly cross-references them with your past experiences, the current context, and the concepts you've learned from your culture, and it instantly builds an emotion to explain the physical sensation.
So the physical inputs are identical, but the context creates the feeling. Like if my heart is racing and my stomach is dropping, my brain checks the environment. If I'm strapped into a roller coaster, my brain constructs the concept of excitement. But if I'm walking alone in a dark parking garage, my brain uses the exact same physical signals to construct fear. The emotion is built on the fly to help me survive the specific moment.
Yes, and the implications of interoception for emotional regulation are paradigm shifting. Under the classic model, the emotion happens to you and then you apply a regulatory tool to manage it. But if emotions are constructed in real time by your brain interpreting your body's data, then emotion regulation and emotion generation are indistinguishable.
Because you can't cleanly regulate something that your brain is actively assembling.
Precisely. The way you frame the bodily sensation is the generation of the emotion.
Wow. This theory completely rewrites the rules of engagement with our own minds. But bringing all this dense theory back down to earth, what does this mean for you, the listener, navigating your life today? Emotional regulation sits at the dead center of the modern mental health conversation.
It really does. Clinically, a profound difficulty with regulating emotions is a defining feature of conditions like borderline personality disorder. That's why psychologist Marsha Linehan developed DBT, dialectical behavior therapy.
And that doesn't focus on analyzing childhood trauma, right?
No, it explicitly trains patients in these exact regulatory executive functions we've been talking about, teaching them distress tolerance and situation modification.
We also see the absence of these skills dominating the cultural conversation about technology. Jonathan Haidt's 2024 book, The Anxious Generation, argues that constant digital stimulation from smartphones and social media algorithms has eroded the exact delay of gratification and self-soothing skills that Walter Mischel observed in those preschoolers.
Yeah, we are losing the mental muscle of attentional deployment because we have outsourced it. Our devices instantly deploy our attention for us the second we feel a hint of boredom or anxiety.
And workplace burnout is increasingly understood as a symptom of chronic suppression. Masking your frustration for 8 hours a day in a customer-facing role carries the exact same physiological tax that Gross and Levinson found in their lab with those terrifying films, just stretched out agonizingly over years.
Exactly. But amidst all these challenges, there is a very empowering takeaway from this deep dive into your sources. Emotion regulation is not a fixed personality trait.
You aren't just born with self-control.
And you aren't biologically doomed to be dysregulated forever. It is a highly trainable toolkit of executive functions.
You can deliberately practice situation modification. You can learn to use affect labeling to force blood flow to your prefrontal cortex and calm your amygdala. It's neurological hardware that you can intentionally upgrade.
And the fact that these strategies can be mapped, measured, and taught that is the foundational premise of modern therapeutic interventions, mindfulness practices, and effective parenting.
I want to leave you with a final thought. Building on Lisa Feldman Barrett's theory of interoception, the idea that our complex emotions are just rapid assemblies of raw bodily sensations. The next time you feel a massive, overwhelming wave of emotion rolling in a sudden flash of intense anger at a coworker, or a deep, sinking dread about your future, what if you didn't try to outthink it? What if you didn't use cognitive reappraisal or attentional deployment or try to actively regulate it at all?
Right. What if you just paused the mental gymnastics and asked yourself, am I actually just physically uncomfortable right now?
Exactly. Am I severely sleep deprived? Is my blood sugar crashing? We constantly mistake a physical deficit for a psychological crisis. If our most complex emotions are essentially just our brain's best guess at why our body feels weird, maybe the ultimate emotional regulation strategy isn't a complex cognitive reframing exercise. Maybe the most scientifically sound way to manage your feelings is just eating a sandwich and taking a nap.
Honestly, sometimes it really is just the sandwich.
We want to sincerely thank you for bringing such an incredibly rigorous and thought-provoking stack of sources to the table today. From the boxer's rage to the brain's prediction engine, the way you understand your own mind just got a major upgrade. Keep asking the deep questions, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.